Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are privileged to study the final chapter of the book of Jeremiah, the book of Yirmiyahu, chapter 52. And with this we will conclude our study of this incredibly inspiring and incredibly tragic book that we've been studying together now for a while. This chapter changes the mode a bit. We leave completely the prophetic pronouncements that have characterized most of this book. There's no mention of Jeremiah himself, and it may even seem the fact that the last chapter 51 ended adhena until this point is the words of Yirmiyahu. It would almost seem that this was added on as a postscript by someone else. It's important to note that this is it's extremely similar in content and in words to the last chapter of the second book of Kings, which summarizes the same events. It's worthwhile for those who want to study in more depth to place in front of you a copy of this chapter and juxtapose it next to a copy of that chapter of the end of the book of 2 Kings, of Melachim Bet. But I may point out some differences, but the similarities and the differences are important to see. But this is also a little bit of a summary of some history, and we'll end off on a little bit of a nice note, a little bit of a slight comforting note, which kind of summarizes our feeling that we had throughout Jeremiah, that we read of a lot of destruction, a lot of death, a lot of suffering, a lot of sin, but there's always a thread of hope, a thread of hope for a better future, a possibility that things could be and will be better, and we'll get that sense from this last chapter. So let's begin with verse 1. Ben Esrim v'achat Shana Tzidkiyahu b'Melcho. Tzidkiyahu, the final and last king of Judah, was 21 years old when he became king. V'achat esrei shana malach b'Yerushalayim, and he was a king in Jerusalem for a total of 11 years. V'shem imo, his mother's name was Chamutal bat Yirmiyahu milivna. Her name was Chamutal, and she was the daughter of another person by the same name, Jeremiah from Livna. This is not the same as Jeremiah from Anatot, who was the author of this book. A different Jeremiah had a daughter named Chamutal. She married, she was the mother of the king Tzidkiyahu. Vayas hora be'enei Adonai, and Tzidkiyahu did evil in God's eyes, k'chol asher asa Yehoiakim, just like his predecessor Yehoiakim did. Remember, his predecessor was Yehoiakim, because during the days of Yehoiakim, his predecessor, the anger of God was against Jerusalem and Judah, until it came to the point where Nebuchadnezzar came and attacked and threw many of the people out of Jerusalem because of their rebellion. By that time, Yehoiakim himself, who had led this rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, was dead, and his successor Yehoiachin was king for a very short period of time. So when Nebuchadnezzar attacked, Yehoiachin was the king, and he was sent to Babylon as a captive, and we'll get back to Yehoiachin later. Vayimrod Tzidkiyahu b'melech Bavel. Now Tzidkiyahu himself followed the same path and rebelled against the king of Babylon. So the inevitable result of his rebellion was, verse 4, Vayi b'shana ha'tishiyit l'malcho. It occurred in the 9th year of his kingdom, b'chodesh ha'asiri, in the 10th month. That's the month of Tevet, the Jewish month of Tevet, and the 10th month of the year, b'asar l'chodesh, on the 10th day, which we now know is the 10th day of Tevet, which is the fast day, which commemorates this bad event that we're about to read about. What happened? Ba Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, the king of Babylon, came. Nebuchadnezzar was his name, who v'chol chelo, he and his entire army, al Yerushalayim, They came upon Jerusalem by Achanu Allah, and they camped around it by Yivnu Allah del Yek Saviv, and they built siege works around the city, a siege wall around Jerusalem. Batavo ha'ir b'matzor, and the city went into a state, remained under siege at Ashtei Asrei Shanal Mal Tzidkiyahu for approximately 2 years, until the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu's reign. So from the year 9 till year 11, Jerusalem was under siege, which is a significant amount of time for the city to hold out against a mighty army. However, B'chodesh HaRevi'i B'Tishal HaChodesh, in the 4th month of the year, which is the month of Tammuz, on the 9th day of Tammuz, V'yachazak harav b'ir, the hunger was severe in the city. There was no more food left. There was no more food left to feed the people. So the siege had to end. The people had to capitulate. What happened? V'tibaka ha'ir, the wall of the city was breached because the defenders could no longer defend it. And the warriors wanted to escape. They knew what their fate would be in the hands of the attackers. So Yivruchu, they ran, and they snuck out of the city at night under the cover of darkness. Derech shar bein hachomotayim asher al gan hamelach, through the gate that was between the double walls near the royal garden. Exactly what this means is referring to someone at the time would have known exactly where this was, but a place that they were able to sneak out without being seen in the cover of darkness by the besieging army of the Chaldeans and Babylonians. The Chaldeans were camped around the city, and they went into the Judean desert in an attempt to escape. We know in that desert there are many valleys and caves and all kinds of places to hide. If you're going to run away and try to hide, it's a pretty a good plan. If you're going to try to get away from this massive army, for lack of very many other good plans. Verse 8, so of course, and among the warriors was the king himself, Tzidkiyahu, who also snuck out with them. So the army of the Chaldeans, when they found that the king had absconded, had ran, they chased after him. They sent out search parties through the desert, and eventually they caught him by Asigu at Tzidkiyahu bi'arbot Yerechel, and they found him in the plains of Jericho. V'chol chelo nafotzu me'alav, and his entire army just abandoned him and scattered around into the various caves and crevices and valleys and places to see if they can hide, while the king himself was captured by the invading army. They grabbed the king, they seized him, and they brought him to the place where the king himself was camped, which was slightly north in a city called Rivla, which was in the Hamatz region. By Daber Ito Mishpatim, and he spoke with him harshly. This could also be translated, and he put him on trial. Mishpatim here could mean just he spoke, and the king Nebuchadnezzar was obviously very upset with Tzidkiyahu for the rebellion, which was the reason for this entire siege and all of this destruction. He now had him under his hand, and he spoke with him harshly. And the verdict was as follows, and carried out as follows in verse 10. Vayishchat melech Bavel et bnei Tzidkiyahu le'einav. The king of Babylon then went and slaughtered all of the sons of Tzidkiyahu right in front of his eyes. V'gam et kol sarei Yehuda shachat b'Rivlata, and all of the officers of Judea, he also slaughtered them there in Rivla, in that place. The Rashi brings a rabbinic legend or a rabbinic tradition that this Sarei Yehuda is referring to the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic leaders, because they had supported Tzidkiyahu in his rebellion. They apparently, even the rabbinic leadership did not listen to the prophet Jeremiah either, who counseled not to rebel against them. And the rabbinic leadership actually gave Tzidkiyahu permission to not keep the vow that he had made. Tzidkiyahu was put in place, in power, by Nebuchadnezzar to be a vassal, and he had promised not to rebel. And the rabbis gave him permission to break his vow, and their punishment was to also be slaughtered at this point here by the king of Babylon. This is the rabbinic tradition that Rashi brings over, Rashi mentions on this verse. And then after slaughtering all of his sons, and after slaughtering all of the rabbinic leadership, or just the leadership, then Vet'ene Tzidkiyahu Iver, he put out the eyes of Tzidkiyahu by Yasreo ben Chushtayim, and he was changed in metal chains. By Ehu Melech Bavel Bavela, and the king of Babylon brought him to Babylon. By Etnehu Beit Hapekudot Adyon Moso, and he put him in prison, where he remained until the day of his death. And then Uvachodesh HaChamishi Be'asor LaChodesh, in the 5th month, which this is the month of Av, on the 10th day of the month, Hishnat Tisha Esrei Shana LaMelech Nebuchadrezzar, which is also the 19th year of the King Nebuchadrezzar, Melech Bavel of Babylon's reign. Then Ba Nebuzaradan Ravat Tabachim, Nebuzaradan, who was the Babylonians' chief general, Amad Lifnei Melech Bavel B'Yerushalayim, he stood in front of the king, with the king of Babylon in Jerusalem. So the walls were breached. There was still some fighting going on, so this is a couple of weeks later. Now the entire invading army has taken over Jerusalem, and the chief general is standing in Jerusalem. It mentions the 10th day of the month of Av, which may surprise some of you. As we know, we mourn the destruction of the temple as the 9th day of Av, and it mentions it here on the 10th day of Av. How this should be reconciled? There's a lot of traditions about it. Some will say that they entered on the 9th day of Av, but they actually burnt down the house of God on the 10th day of Av, and the rabbis decided to make the fast on the 9th day. Also, there are other tragedies that happen on the 9th day, so when they had to pick the day, they picked the 9th. But either way, it was the 10th day that the following happened. Verse 13, by Yisrof at Beit Adonai, they burnt down the house of God, Viet Beit HaMelech, and the palace of the king. We had Kol Batei Yerushalayim, and all the prominent houses in Jerusalem. We had Kol Beit Hagadol Saraf Peish, and the house of every notable, important person was burnt in flame. Or it also could mean Beit Hagadol, the important building of the V'et Kol Chomot Yerushalayim Saviv, and they continued by destroying all of the walls that surrounded Jerusalem. Notzu Kol Chel Chastim, the armies of the Chaldeans crushed them. Asheret Rabat Tabachim, those armies that were being led by the chief of the guards. Umidalo Ta'am, and we just mentioned that the leadership had been either executed or had run to escape. So from the poor people of the nation that were still stuck within the walls that were there, and the remaining people, not necessarily the poor ones, but the middle class, so to speak, that were also remaining in the city. And those that had surrendered during the siege to the Babylonian side, and the remaining craftsmen among the people, the chief of the guard, the head general, Nebuzaradan of the Babylonians, exiled them to Babylon. However, from some of them, Midalot Haaretz, and from the poorest of the people, Hishir Nebuzaradan Rav Tabachim, Nebuzaradan, the chief general, allowed them to stay in the area, L'chormim U'Liogvim, in order to tend the fields and the vineyards, to help so that the land should remain settled, the land should remain productive. In order to be a productive part of the Babylonian Empire, it made sense to leave them there. And we know what their fate was. Those were the ones that ended up being led by Gedaliah, and so on. We read those chapters earlier. Yet, now we're going to list many of the structures and vessels that were in the temple that were destroyed and or removed by the Babylonians and taken to Babylon as booty. This gives us a sense of the grandeur of the structure, the physical grandeur of the structure, and also the history. Some of these things that had been built in the days of Solomon talking about going back hundreds of years, it is now being taken apart in order to drive home the tragedy of the destruction. Describing the building and the items in the building helps drive home a terrible sense of loss. And that's what we're about to start reading in verse 17. V'et amudei hanechoshet, and the bronze pillars, asher leveit Adonai, which were in the temple of God. V'et hamichonot, and the stands, v'et yam hanechoshet, asher beveit Adonai, and the bronze sea. This means this giant bronze water reservoir, which was in the house of God. Sheberu chastim, the Chaldeans smashed it. Vayesu et kol nechushtam bavela, and all of the bronze or the copper was taken off to Babylon as booty. V'et hasirot, v'et hayoim, v'et hamizamrot, v'et hamizrakot, v'et hakapot, and the pots, the shovels, the shears, the sprinkling bowls, the ladles, v'et kol kalei nechoshet, and all of the bronze vessels asher yisharsu v'hem that were used in the temple services, lakachu, they took them all. V'et hasipim, v'et hamachtot, v'et hamizrakot, v'et hasirot, v'et hamenorot, and the basins and the fire pans and the sprinkling bowls and the lampstands and the ladles and the jars and the pots. V'et hakapot, v'et hamenakiot, asher zahav, that which was gold was gold. In other words, the last verse 18 was talking about the copper or bronze items. Now we're talking about the golden items, kesef, and many that were made out of silver. Lakach rav tabochim, the general Nebuzaradan took them all with him back to Babylon. Ha'amudim shnayim, the two great pillars, the hayom echad, and the one molten sea is another giant water reservoir. V'habakar shnei asar, and the 12 bronze cattle nechoshet asher tachat hamechonot that were underneath the sea. There was those statues of bronze oxen that upon which this giant container for water was kept. Asher asa hamelech Shlomo leveit Adonai, that King Solomon made in honor of the house of God. Lo haya mishkal in nechushtam, there was so much bronze, so much metal that they couldn't even weigh and measure how much it was. Kol hakelim ha'ela, when you add up all of these vessels. V'yoha amudim, and as for the pillars, shmona esrei amah komat amud echad, each pillar was 18 amot high, which would be somewhere in the range of just under 30 feet tall. V'chut shteim esrei amma yisubenu, its circumference was 12 amot, so it would have a circumference of somewhere around 18 to 20 feet. V'avyo, and its width arba etzbaot navov, the metal was 4 fingers thick, like several inches thick. It was hollow in it, but it's just a massive amount of metal. V'koteret olav nechoshet, and it had on top of it's a capital made out of bronze. V'komat hakoteret achat, and the height of each capital was 5 amot, was 5 amot. Sivachav rimonim ala koteret, and there was meshwork and metal pomegranates decorating, surrounding the capital. Saviv kakol nechoshet, all made out of bronze. V'cha'ela la'amud hasheni rimonim, and the same thing for both pillars. Vayiyu harimonim tishim v'shisha rucha, there was 96 pomegranates facing each direction, or facing all the directions. Kol harimonim me'ah al hasivacha saviv, with room for 100 pomegranates all around the meshwork. Verse 24, Vayikach rav hatavochim. So this was just describing the items that they took of bronze and copper and gold. Vayikach rav hatavochim et Seroya kohen harosh. And the chief of the guards, so again the general, took the temple leadership. He took Seroya, who was the high priest, Vet Zephaniah kohen hamishna, who was the deputy high priest, Vet Shloshet shomrei hatzaf, and the 3 people that were in charge of the temple, keepers of the threshold is how it's translated. They took one eunuch who happened to be one of the war generals. He was in charge of the army, and he took 7 of the king's top advisors that were still in the city. I guess they hadn't run and escaped with those that tried to escape. And the scribe of the general of the army, who was in charge of getting the people to enlist in the Judean army, the Shishim Ish Me'am and 60 people from the common folk, and Nebuzaradan, the chief general, took all of these people, all of these leadership, and he took also them to the king of Babylon, where he was in Rivla, where the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up his place. And the king of Babylon executed all of these people. And this is how Judah became exiled from its land. This is the number of those. This is the I'm at verse 28 now. This is the number of people that Nebuchadnezzar exiled in the 7th year of his reign. Mishnah Sheva, Yehudim 3,023 members of the Judean tribe. These numbers don't necessarily sound the same as the numbers in this similar chapter in Kings. How to reconcile those differences is not something I'm going to spend time on, but the point is that there was a lot of people. Bishnat Shmona Esrei, in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar Yerushalayim, then in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's ruling of his kingdom, he then exiled another nefesh, another group of souls, Shmona Meos Shloshim Mishnayim, another 832, and then in the Bishnat Shlosh V'Esrim, several years later, this would have been 5 years later, there were still people there. This is after Gedaliah had already been assassinated and most of the Jews had abandoned, but there were still some Judeans hanging on, staying there. But by this year, the Heglan was Radan Rabatabachim Yehudim, the chief general, again took of the members of the Judean tribe, Nefesh Sheva Me'osar Boy Machamisha, 745 people, Kol Nefesh, a total of 4,600 people. This doesn't include women, children, and again, the numbers in Kings are recorded to be much larger numbers. I'm not going to go into it. The point being that he exiled everyone from Jerusalem, and there were no Judeans left. Now, we're going to look at verse 31. It's going to be a little bit of a different flavor. If you remember, Yehoiakim was the king, and he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Yehoiakim died, and his son Yehoiachin took over, who was only a king for a short amount of time. And he was the king when Nebuchadnezzar came to attack Jerusalem the first time. Since he was the king of Judah when Nebuchadnezzar attacked, Nebuchadnezzar sent him into exile into Babylon. He took him to Babylon together with many of the noblemen and craftsmen and so on. We've discussed this several times in other chapters. But now let's focus. Let's take Yehoiachin. He's sitting in prison now in Babylon, together also imprisoned with all the other kings in the Babylonian Empire who had rebelled, and he was just basically, unfortunately, wasting away in prison. He was a symbol of the subjugation of Judah to the people, the Judeans who are now in exile in Babylon. They always knew that their king Yehoiachin was sitting in a Babylonian jail. However, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, Nasa Avil Merodach Melech Bavel. Avil Merodach was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is now no longer king. His son now takes over. And Avil Merodach, the king of Babylon, Bishnat Malchuto, when he became king, he raised at Rosh Yachin Melech Yehuda. He raised the head. What that means is that he recognized that Yehoiachin was someone whom he can have faith in as a loyal person, and instead of leaving him to rot, so to speak, in jail, he took him out of jail. This was kind of a sign of respect to the people of Judah, and as you can imagine, the people of Judah who were in exile, knowing that their former king is now taken out of jail and being treated more respectfully, what must have been a very encouraging sign. Vayedaber ito tovot, this is verse 32, and he spoke to him nice words. Vayitain et kitso, and he placed his seat mima'al chisei hamelachim asher ito bebavel. He gave him like an honor higher than the other kings that were captive in Babylon. In other words, he said of all of these, he gave him a position of honor, kind of like the head of the captive kings. Vishinat bigdei kilo, and he took him out of his prison clothing and put him in more respectable clothing. V'yachal lechem lefonav tamid kol yimei chayav, and he gave him, and he allowed him to eat at the king's table the rest of his life. Aruchato aruchat tamid, and he gave him a regular meal. Nitnolo was given to him. Eit melech Bavel, he had rations given to him every day from the king of Babylon, Varyom biyomo, each and every day, ad yom oto, until the day of his death, kol yimei chayav, the rest of his life. This is a little bit of hope, showing that there is some hope. The king of Judea was treated with a little bit of respect. You can just imagine that what this did to the spirit of the people of Judah in Babylon. It said, it's not all over. Our king has been taken out of prison. Our king is living a respectable life in the court. Maybe one day we can reestablish our nation. A little words of hope that is appropriate to end this book of Jeremiah together, that despite all of the terrible destruction that we see, we're left with a little shine, a little glimmer of something good to come, which Jeremiah had prophesied about so many times, that the Babylonian Empire would soon fall, and as a result of that, the Persians would take over, and that they would allow the Jews to begin to return and rebuild their land and rebuild the temple a second time around. This was a privilege of mine to study this book of Jeremiah together with you. Those of you that have been with me the whole way, those of you that have only joined for parts, every single person, thank you so much for studying with me. I do feel as if we're studying together, and let us hope to always end every day, every moment of our lives with some hope, with some encouragement, with some good tidings for the future, and looking forward to continuing the study of the prophets together.